Hello. Welcome. Leave where you speak in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe. And now let's get started. My name is Michael Thompson. I'm 34. What happened in Montana was in just another RV trip. It was the night everything changed. I'd always dreamed of photographing the northern lights, and Glacier National Park seemed perfect for my new RV's maiden voyage. The drive up from Seattle had been peaceful. Almost too peaceful in retrospect. If I'd known what awaited me in those mountains, I would have turned around immediately. But hindsight doesn't help when you're already marked. The campground seemed ideal when I pulled in. Secluded, pristine, with a clear view of the starlit sky. The elderly couple managing checked and seemed oddly hesitant when I mentioned staying for a week. Site 13 is all we have left, the woman said, her hands trembling slightly as she processed my payment. Her husband kept glancing at my RV's gleaming exterior, as if searching for something. I assumed they were just being overly cautious with a solo traveler. Later, I'd understand their fear. The first warning came that afternoon, though I was too excited about my trip to recognize it. While setting up my camera equipment, I noticed deep gouges in a nearby tree. Not typical bear marks. These were different. They formed a strange pattern, almost like symbols. A passing ranger quickly dismissed my concerns, probably just vandals, but I caught him taking photos of the marks when he thought I wasn't looking. That should have been my first clue that something wasn't right. As night fell, the temperature dropped dramatically, and an unusual silence settled over the campground. No crickets, no rustling leaves, no distant animal calls, just absolute stillness, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring and your skin crawl. I'd brought high-end recording equipment for capturing ambient nature sounds to accompany my photos, but the meters showed only a flat line. Even the wind seemed to die completely, leaving an unnatural void. The first truly inexplicable events began around midnight. My camera's external battery pack, fully charged hours earlier, completely drained in minutes. The backup followed suit immediately after. Electronic interference filled my monitors with strange patterns, not random static, but organized shapes that seemed to pulse with purpose. My satellite phone picked up what sounded like whispers in a language I didn't recognize, growing louder with each passing minute. Then came the screech, a sound no human or animal throat could produce. It started as a low vibration that made my teeth ache, building to a piercing frequency that shattered my coffee mug. As I scrambled to document the phenomenon, my cameras captured a massive shadow moving between the trees. The footage showed something impossible, a shape that seemed to bend reality around it, leaving trails of darkness in its wake. And then I heard the unmistakable sound of claws scraping metal, coming from directly above my RV. I froze as the scratching continued overhead, a methodical pattern that felt deliberate, almost like writing. The sound traveled slowly from the front of the RV to the back, metal groaning under impossible pressure. My initial thought was a bear, but bears don't move with such calculated precision. Bears don't take their time, and bears certainly don't scratch patterns that glow faintly in the dark, which is exactly what I discovered when I finally gathered the courage to look outside. Logic told me to call the rangers, but my satellite phone now displayed impossible coordinates, showing my location as simultaneously in Montana and somewhere in the Arctic Circle. The regular phone had no signal, and my laptop refused to boot, displaying only strange symbols similar to the tree markings I'd seen earlier. I told myself there had to be rational explanations, electromagnetic interference, altitude effects, maybe even hallucinogenic spores from some mountain fungus. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. The next hours brought a series of increasingly impossible events. My compass spun wildly, its needle tracking something moving in circles around my RV. Temperature readings fluctuated between extremes, one sensor showing -40°F, while another 10 feet away read 98°F. Motion-activated lights triggered in systematic patterns, forming the same symbols I'd seen scratched into the tree. Most disturbing were the footprints appearing in the frost-covered ground, prints that formed in real time with no visible source. When dawn finally broke, I documented everything. The claw marks on my RV's roof formed intricate geometric patterns, unlike anything I'd seen before. The metal wasn't just scratched, it was altered at a molecular level, with sections appearing decades older than others. My cameras had captured hundreds of photos on their own, each showing the same dark figure from different angles, growing progressively closer. Most telling was the residue left behind, a crystalline substance that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The elderly couple from the office arrived early, drawn by what they later told me were the sounds. Their faces fell when they saw the markings on my RV. "It's starting again," the husband whispered, pulling out a thick file folder. Inside were dozens of similar reports spanning decades, all from Site 13, all involving RVS, all describing the same phenomena. Photos showed identical markings on other vehicles, identical crystalline residue. "We tried to warn them," the wife said, "but they shut us down." Just then, my equipment suddenly sprang to life, all devices activating simultaneously. The screens displayed a single image, a topographical map of the area with dozens of pulsing dots, each marking the location of a previous incident. The dots formed a massive version of the same symbol now carved into my RV's roof. As we watched in horror, a new dot appeared at my location, and deep in the forest, something answered with a sound that made the previous night's screech seem tame in comparison. The situation deteriorated rapidly after that. The couple rushed back to their office to contact authorities, but I could see their phone lines were dead through my window. The few other campers began packing up with urgent haste, their engines turning over frantically, but none of the vehicles would start, including my RV. It was as if every piece of machinery in the campground had been simultaneously disabled, stranding us all. My attempt to hike out for help was thwarted almost immediately. The trail I'd driven in on simply ended about half a mile from camp, dissolving into undisturbed forest as if it had never existed. My GPS showed I was walking in circles, despite maintaining a straight path, and my hiking compass spun uselessly. The crystalline residue now covered the ground in patches, spreading like frost, and the air grew thick with an oily mist that seemed to absorb sound. The discoveries got worse. Behind the ranger station, we found a graveyard of abandoned RVs, dozens of them dating back decades. Each bore the same intricate markings as mine, their metal aged and warped in impossible ways. Inside one, I found a journal from 1983, describing an identical sequence of events. The final entry contained a crude sketch of something the writer had seen. I tore those pages out immediately, unable to look at them for more than a few seconds without feeling physically ill. Our first direct encounter came that afternoon. One of the other campers, a young guy traveling alone, started screaming about seeing something in his rearview mirrors. By the time we reached him, his RV's entire metal frame had aged decades in minutes. The windows were covered in those glowing symbols, and inside, his camera had captured an image so horrifying that I immediately destroyed the memory card, but not before noting that the entity had no consistent shape. It seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The Rangers finally arrived, but proved worse than useless. They insisted on protocol despite the growing evidence of something impossible happening. As they took statements, I noticed their badges had the same symbols subtly worked into the design. One Ranger's eyes reflected light at impossible angles, and his shadow moved independently of his body. When questioned about the abandoned RVs, they claimed the area was private property, despite being in the middle of a national park. Everything changed at sunset. The oily mist turned blood red, and every piece of metal in the campground began resonating at the same frequency. The symbols on my V started pulsing with their own light, and through my cameras, I could finally see what had been haunting us. The entity moved like liquid smoke, its form constantly shifting, but now it moved with purpose. I barely had time to grab my most important evidence before it attacked the nearest RV, peeling its metal frame apart like paper. The screams that followed will haunt me forever. The attack triggered total chaos. Everyone ran in different directions, but I knew better. Splitting up was exactly what it wanted. I grabbed the elderly couple and 3 other campers, barricading us inside the ranger station, through the windows. We watched in horror as the entity systematically destroyed every vehicle in the campground, taking its time, almost like it was searching for something specific. The rangers had vanished, leaving behind empty uniforms that crumbled to dust when touched. Our survival attempts focused on understanding the symbols. The couple revealed they'd been documenting similar incidents for years, collecting patterns and correlations. The markings weren't random, they were some kind of ancient language, predating human civilization. Each attack followed the same sequence of symbols, like a ritual or hunting pattern. We worked frantically to decipher them, knowing our lives depended on understanding what we were facing. The direct encounter came without warning. One moment we were huddled over decades of documentation. The next the entity simply existed inside the room with us, up close. Its true form was maddening, a geometric impossibility that hurt to look at directly. It moved like stop-motion animation played back wrong, each movement leaving traces of itself across multiple points in space. The air crackled with electromagnetic energy so intense it made our feelings vibrate. In that moment of sheer terror, something clicked. The symbols, the patterns, they weren't a hunting ritual, they were a feeding pattern. The entity wasn't destroying our VS randomly. It was harvesting some kind of energy created by human fear while traveling. The elderly couple had unknowingly been helping it for years, documenting its feeding habits. As this realization hit, the entity's form shifted, acknowledging our understanding with horrible intelligence. Time seemed to stop as it reached for us with appendages that existed in too many dimensions. The couple's decades of documentation burst into flames, but not before I glimpsed a crucial detail, a pattern of symbols that supposedly acted as a ward. With seconds to act, I started drawing the counter symbols on the walls with the crystalline residue that covered my hands. The entity recoiled, its form destabilizing as the symbols began to glow. The moment of victory was short-lived, though the entity retreated. The symbols I'd drawn began to burn through the walls, spreading across the ranger station's structure like cancer. The building groaned as reality warped around us. We ran for the exit as dimensions began to fold in on themselves. I remember reaching the door, remember seeing the campground distort like a reflection in broken glass. Then everything went black as the entity's screech reached a frequency that human consciousness couldn't process. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital in Missoula, one of only 2 survivors. The elderly couple and 2 others never made it out of the ranger station, which had apparently burned to the ground, though the official report cited natural causes. My RV was found 20 miles away, its metal frame aged and twisted, the symbols now permanently etched into every surface. The other survivor hadn't spoken a word since that night, but they found him frantically drawing the same symbols over and over in his hospital room. The apparent escape came with disturbing revelations. My cameras had captured everything, but reviewing the footage showed more than I remembered. In every frame, the entity appeared in the background, getting progressively closer over months of photos, including ones taken long before I reached Montana. It had been stalking me since I bought the RV, using the vehicle as a beacon to track its prey. The symbols weren't just markings, they were a brand of ownership. The consequences manifested in unsettling ways. The crystalline residue had left permanent scarring on my hands, scars that glow faintly in the dark and feel ice cold to the touch. Electronic devices malfunction around me, and mirrors show brief glimpses of impossible geometries in my shadow. Most disturbing are the dreams, vivid visions of other victims throughout history, all marked with the same symbols, all eventually claimed by the entity. I haven't slept properly since that night. Further investigation revealed a pattern wish I'd never found. Similar incidents have been reported at campgrounds across the country, always involving RVs, always near ancient sites or ley lines. The symbols appear in Native American petroglyphs, warning travelers away from certain routes. I found references in classified government documents about temporal anomalies and missing persons cases spanning centuries. Every lead connected back to the same entity, suggesting it's been hunting humans since we first became nomadic. The connections painted a terrifying picture. The entity doesn't just hunt, it cultivates. The ranger station, the campground, even the elderly couple, all were part of its feeding ground. It allows some victims to escape, knowing they'll draw others to the same locations. The symbols mark both its territory and its future prey. Every person who sees them becomes a beacon, attracting more potential victims. The hospitalized survivor killed himself last night, leaving the symbols drawn in his own blood across his room. 1 week after my escape, I received an unmarked package containing a single photograph. It showed my RV at a campground I'd never visited, dated 3 weeks in the future. In the window's reflection, a familiar darkness gathered, its form bending reality around the edges of the frame. The back of the photo was marked with fresh symbols, coordinates for dozens of campgrounds across the country. As I write this, I can hear metal groaning outside my home, and my shadow no longer matches my movements. The hunt isn't over. It's only just beginning. My name is Eva Chen. I'm 28. What happened in Nevada in just another RV trip? It was the night everything changed. Death Valley had always called to me as a photographer, its stark beauty promising unique shots. July might seem crazy for desert camping, but the heat meant solitude. My customized RV had top-notch climate control and solar power. I thought I was prepared for anything. I was wrong. The ranger at the entrance station seemed odd, staring too long at my RV's registration. "You're the third photographer this month," she said, though the logbook she held was clearly empty. Her nameplate kept shifting in the heat waves, sometimes showing different names. I blamed it on the 115-degree temperature. The desert plays tricks on your mind, they say, but sometimes the tricks are real. That first warning came as I set up camp. My radio caught fragments of conversations, not current chatter, but snippets that sounded decades old. Civil War soldiers, Spanish conquistadors, Native American dialects, all describing the same thing: lights in the heat waves, shapes that shouldn't exist. I recorded everything, telling myself I'd struck interference from military testing. The ranger's logbook had shown coordinates, identical to transmissions from 1851. Night in Death Valley brings an alien silence. No wind, no animals, just the settling of heated earth. But something else moved in that silence. The air rippled like water, forming shapes just at the edge of vision. My thermal camera captured temperature anomalies, cold spots in 110-degree air. Moving with purpose, they formed patterns that matched petroglyphs I'd photographed earlier. Ancient warnings I should have heeded. The first undeniable signs appeared around midnight. My RV's metal surfaces developed strange patterns, not rust or corrosion, but perfect geometric shapes that seemed to right themselves. The air conditioning failed despite full power, temperatures inside rising impossibly fast. Outside, heat mirages danced in the darkness, a phenomenon that shouldn't exist without sunlight. My cameras caught glimpses of something using those mirages as camouflage. Then the real horror began. A sound like glass cracking filled the air, but it wasn't glass. It was reality itself fracturing around me. Through my cameras, I saw it, a creature made of heat and light, bending space around itself, ancient and patient. It had used the desert's mirages to hunt for centuries. As my electronics melted, one by one, I realized with terror that I wasn't documenting it. It was documenting me. The heat mirage creature moved like liquid light, testing my RV's defenses. Every metal surface it touched turned molten, forming those same geometric patterns I'd seen in the petroglyphs. My camera's memory cards liquefied, but not before transferring their data to my laptop. The footage showed something impossible, a being that existed in the spectrum between heat and light, using temperature differences to tear holes in reality. I tried radioing for help, but every frequency carried the same voices I'd heard earlier. The messages overlap now, creating a pattern, coordinates and timestamps forming a timeline of disappearances. Each location matched a heat anomaly. Each date marked a missing traveler. My GPS showed my location jumping between centuries, as if time itself was melting in the desert heat. The ranger's shifting nameplate suddenly made terrible sense. The next star brought phenomena that defied physics. Shadows cast at impossible angles, falling upward instead of down. temperature readings that broke my instruments, spots of absolute zero next to points hot enough to melt steel. The creature had brought friends, their heat shimmer forms rippling through dimensions as they circled my RV. My cameras caught them phasing through solid matter, leaving perfectly geometric burn marks in their wake. The evidence became undeniable. My thermal imaging revealed their true form, ancient geometry given life through desert heat. They moved like mathematical equations made flesh, each angle precisely calculated to tear through dimensional barriers. The melted electronics formed patterns, matching on Asazi cave drawings I'd photographed earlier. The ancient tribes hadn't drawn warnings, they'd drawn instructions for survival. Everything electronic began to fail systematically. Solar panels reversed their charge, batteries burst into flame, and my satellite phone displayed text in languages that predated written history. The temperature inside the RV climbed past 130 degrees despite the night air cooling outside. The metal walls sweated impossible symbols that glowed with their own inner heat. Something was trying to cook me out of my shelter. Then my laptop displayed one final image before melting. A thermal map of Death Valley spanning centuries. Every tourist's disappearance, every lost traveler, every mysterious accident, all formed a vast pattern of geometric shapes across the desert floor. As the screen liquefied, I saw my own coordinates appear in the pattern. The creatures weren't just hunting, they were completing a design started centuries ago, and I was meant to be the final piece. The situation deteriorated into a nightmare of heat and light. The creatures herded me away from my RV, using concentrated heat to make certain paths unbearable. The temperature differentials created visible distortions in the air, forming corridors that seemed to lead in impossible directions. Every route I took somehow led to ancient petroglyphs, each depicting the same geometric entities. The desert itself was their maze, and I was running their course. My attempt to reach the ranger station revealed worse horrors. The building existed in multiple states simultaneously, sometimes whole, sometimes decades abandoned, sometimes not yet built. Through my remaining camera, I saw park rangers from different eras occupying the same space, their forms overlapping like heat waves. Each wore the same shifting nameplate I'd seen earlier. They weren't rangers at all. They were previous victims, trapped in temporal loops. The discoveries accelerated with my growing terror. The creatures didn't just hunt humans, they harvested time itself. Each victim became a temporal anchor, forced to repeat their final moments eternally. The heat mirages were windows into these loops, showing hundreds of travelers caught in the moment of their capture. Their combined fear generated the impossible temperatures that the entities needed to maintain their presence in our dimension. Our confrontation came at the heart of their maze, surrounded by ancient stones carved with mathematical proofs that hurt to look at. I faced creatures that had evolved beyond physical form. They existed as pure information encoded in heat differentials, using mirages as windows between dimensions. Through these windows, I saw their true purpose. They were building something vast, using human consciousness as raw material. Each victim added to their impossible equation. The ancient tribes had known about them. The petroglyphs weren't just warnings, they were a record of resistance. Certain geometric counters could disrupt the creatures' patterns, forcing them to reform at great energy cost. I began drawing these shapes with molten metal from my ruined equipment. Using their own weapons against them, the entities reacted with fury. The desert night blazing with sudden auroras as they tried to maintain their form. Fighting back came at a terrible price. Each counter symbol I drew burned itself into my flesh, leaving geometric scars that throbbed with residual heat. The creatures became increasingly desperate, merging into a single mass of impossible angles and burning light. As their combined form reached for me, reality buckled under the strain. The desert floor cracked open, revealing a vast geometric pattern carved into the Earth's crust. In that moment of revelation, everything went white-hot. Consciousness returned in waves of heat and pain. I found myself running through Death Valley's maze of rocks, but something was wrong with time itself. The sun flickered between positions like a broken film, casting multiple shadows that moved independently. The creatures had switched from pursuit to prophecy. showing me glimpses of my own future through their heat mirage windows. Each vision ended in capture. Each path led to assimilation. My survival instincts kicked in as I searched for weaknesses in their pattern. The geometric scars on my skin resonated with their presence, warning me of dimensional thin spots. I began to understand their hunting technique. They didn't chase their prey. They calculated it. Every step I took had been predicted centuries ago. Every escape route plotted as part of their vast equation. The entire valley was a mathematical trap designed to solve itself. The direct confrontation began at sunset. Though the sun couldn't decide where to set, the creatures manifested fully, their heat shimmer forms solidifying into crystalline geometries that ignored physics. They moved like equations given flesh, each motion perfectly calculated to close distance without crossing space. The air between us crackled with temporal discharge, windows into other times opening and closing like blinking eyes. Pure terror unlocked understanding. The petroglyphs had shown more than just counter symbols. They'd revealed the entity's true weakness. These beings required mathematical perfection, and chaos disrupted their patterns. I began moving randomly, making choices even I couldn't predict. Each imperfect action caused them physical pain, their crystalline forms cracking under the strain of calculating impossibilities. The desert itself seemed to shudder as their equation began to fail. The battle reached its peak as reality began to break down. My random actions had introduced too many variables, corrupting their temporal calculations. Windows into other times shattered, releasing centuries of trapped victims. The air filled with overlapping voices as temporal anchors failed, each freed consciousness adding to the chaos. The creature's perfect geometry began to fracture, leaking light and probability into the desert night. Victory seemed within reach until I realized their true endgame. The chaos I'd caused was part of a larger pattern, my very resistance calculated into their grand design. As their forms shattered, they released something older and darker, a primordial equation that existed before time itself. The ground beneath me transformed into living mathematics, geometric patterns spreading like wildfire across the desert floor. Whatever I'd freed was infinitely worse than what I'd been fighting. I woke up in a Las Vegas hospital 3 weeks later. Though according to my phone, only 3 hours had passed. My skin retained the geometric scars, but they weren't burns. Under a microscope, doctors found impossibly complex mathematical formulas encoded in my cellular structure. My body temperature fluctuated between extremes, and electronic devices still malfunctioned in my presence. The creatures had marked me, but for what purpose remained unclear. My apparent escape revealed disturbing patterns. Research showed similar cases stretching back centuries, all sharing common elements: heat mirages, mathematical horrors, and missing time. The ancient tribes had built their settlements in geometric patterns to ward off these entities, using architecture as mathematical counterspells. Modern roads and buildings inadvertently created new summoning patterns, turning the entire Southwest into a vast calculation. The consequences lingered in unexpected ways. My photographs from before the incident showed the creatures had been stalking me for months, appearing as lens flares and heat distortions in every shot. The geometric scars on my skin changed configuration during temperature shifts, solving equations I couldn't comprehend. Most disturbing were the dreams, visions of vast mathematical structures being built across dimensions, using human consciousness as computational nodes. Deeper investigation uncovered a terrifying truth. Death Valley wasn't their only hunting ground. Similar incidents occurred wherever heat mirages were common. Each location formed part of a larger pattern, a geometric web spanning the Earth's surface. Government files spoke of anomalous mathematics and dimensional calculus, hinting at a cosmic computation nearing completion. Every victim added processing power to their grand equation. The connections painted a picture of infinite horror. These weren't just random attacks. They were systematic proofs building toward a mathematical apocalypse. The creatures were solving an equation that would unlock something beyond human comprehension. Each victim's consciousness was converted into computational power, their trapped minds eternal slaves to alien mathematics. The ancient tribes hadn't fought them. They'd merely postponed the inevitable. 1 month after my escape, I found a perfect geometric burn mark on my motel room wall. The alien's equation had followed me. Using my scars as variables in its ongoing calculation, my nightmares showed me the end result, a world transformed into living mathematics, all of reality reduced to pure geometric truth. As I write this, the air around me shimmers with equational intent, and my shadows solve for variables that shouldn't exist. The final calculation has begun, and we're all part of their proof. My name is Marie Blackwood. I'm 31. What happened in Oregon wasn't just another RV trip. It was the night everything changed. As a folklore researcher, I'd heard whispers about Tillamook Forest's unexplained phenomena. The locals called it time rain, precipitation that seemed to age everything it touched. I brought my mobile research station, confident that science could explain the legends. The forest had other plans. The first oddity appeared at the forest entrance, a ranger booth completely overgrown with moss, yet sporting fresh tire tracks. Inside, a logbook showed today's date, with entries from different decades written in identical handwriting. The ranger herself seemed to glitch between ages as she spoke, her uniform cycling through historical styles. I blamed it on the heavy mist playing tricks with the light. Warning signs littered the narrow forest road, not standard park signs, but crude markers carved into ancient trees. Local tribes had depicted figures trapped in spirals of rain, their forms elongated as if stretched through time. My RV's GPS showed impossible readings, claiming we were simultaneously on paths that existed centuries apart. The radio picked up fragments of broadcasts from different eras, all describing the same storm. As evening approached, an unnatural fog rolled in. Unlike regular Pacific Northwest mist, this fog moved with purpose, forming patterns that matched the tree carvings. My weather instruments recorded contradictory data, some areas reading bone dry while adjacent spots showed rainfall amounts impossible for the region. The fog seemed to respond to these measurements, coalescing into shapes that defied natural formation. The first truly inexplicable event came at dusk. Raindrops began falling upward, forming perfect spirals before vanishing into the canopy. My cameras captured impossible footage, water droplets that existed in multiple places simultaneously, creating windows between moments in time. Through these liquid portals, I glimpsed other vehicles, other researchers, all trapped in endless loops of discovery and disappearance. Then the entity revealed itself through the rain, a being composed of liquid time, its form flowing between past and future. Where it touched my RV's metal skin, rust bloomed and vanished in waves, aging and rejuvenating in patterns that hurt to watch. As I scrambled to document the phenomenon, my equipment began recording backwards, showing events that hadn't happened yet. The footage revealed something horrifying. This wasn't my first visit to these woods. According to the timestamps, I'd been here many times before, each visit erased by the time rain. The entity's rain formed complex patterns across my V's windows, each droplet containing reflections of different time periods. Through them, I watched myself arrive at this spot throughout history, sometimes in modern vehicles, sometimes in horse-drawn wagons, always led here by the same mysterious patterns. The timestamps on my cameras jumped randomly between centuries, documenting an endless cycle of arrival and disappearance. Trying to understand, I analyzed my equipment readings. The rain wasn't just water. It contained trace elements that shouldn't exist in nature, particles that seemed to age or degrade anything they touched. My metal tools showed centuries of wear in minutes, then reversed to pristine condition. The patterns matched local tribal accounts of time storms, weather systems that could trap people between moments. Their warnings suddenly felt much more immediate. The phenomenon escalated rapidly. Instruments detected temporal distortions expanding outward from each raindrop, creating bubbles where time flowed differently. Through my cameras, I watched moss grow and die in seconds, trees age and rejuvenate in endless cycles. The rain wasn't just manipulating time, it was harvesting it, collecting fragments of different eras like a cosmic scrapbook. Each drop contained complete timelines, entire lives compressed into liquid moments. Physical evidence mounted impossibly fast. The rain left residue that changed its chemical composition when observed, as if quantum uncertainty applied to time itself. My samples showed organic material that existed in multiple states of decay simultaneously. Most disturbing were the recordings. My audio equipment captured countless voices from different eras, all describing the same entities emerging from the rain. The stories never ended well. Equipment failures spread like a contagion. Electronics aged decades in seconds, their components evolving and devolving through multiple generations of technology. My satellite phone displayed text messages from myself spanning centuries, each warning about the rain entities. The timestamp showed some messages coming from decades in the future, describing horrors I had yet to witness. The rain was breaking down more than just time. It was dissolving the barriers between cause and effect. A revelation struck as I reviewed the data. The entities weren't controlling the rain, they were creating it. Each droplet was a piece of their consciousness, scattered across time to observe and collect human experiences. The forest was their laboratory, and every visitor became an unwitting test subject. Through the fluid windows in my RV's walls, I watched myself come to this same realization countless times before. Then the real storm began. The situation deteriorated as reality itself began to liquefy. The rain intensified, each drop creating its own temporal field. Simple actions became impossible. Reaching for objects meant interacting with hundreds of overlapping timelines. I watched my own hand age and rejuvenate with each movement, skin flowing between youth and decay like ripples in a pond. The entities were toying with causality itself. Escape attempts proved futile and fascinating. Every path through the forest led back to my RV. But in different eras, I found my own footprints fossilized in ancient rock, then watched them form in fresh mud moments later. The entities had created a closed temporal loop, using the rain to maintain a perfect circle of cause and effect. My struggles only added more data to their infinite experiment. Research notes scattered throughout my RV revealed a pattern of discovery. Previous versions of myself had documented similar phenomena, each time reaching slightly different conclusions. The entities were refining their technique through countless iterations, using each cycle to perfect their control over time. My current experience was just one drop in an ocean of temporal experiments, endlessly repeated and revised. Direct contact with the entities shattered my remaining doubts. Their liquid forms moved through dimensions as easily as water flows downhill, each movement leaving trails of compressed time in their wake. They communicated through temporal distortions, showing me visions of their true nature. They weren't just studying time, they were farming it, harvesting human experiences to feed something vast and hungry that existed between moments. The ancient tribes had known more than they recorded. Hidden symbols in their art depicted the entity's life cycle, how they seeded time storms across history, creating infinite loops of human experience they could feed upon. The rain wasn't a weapon or a tool, it was their offspring, each droplet a larval form seeking human consciousness to consume. My RV had become a breeding ground for temporal parasites. Survival instincts kicked in as I realized my role in their cycle. Every observation, every recording, every attempt to understand them only made them stronger. They fed on human comprehension itself, using our attempts to rationalize them as anchor points in reality. The rain wasn't trying to trap me. It was trying to birth something new using my mind as an incubator. Through the temporal windows, I watched this revelation drive countless versions of myself to madness. Pure chaos erupted as the entities began their harvest. Time fractured around my RV, each shard containing fragments of different realities. I watched myself face this moment from infinite angles, each version making slightly different choices. The entities moved between these shards like sharks through bloody water, feeding on the temporal energy generated by my parallel decisions. Survival meant understanding their patterns. The rain formed complex mathematical sequences, equations written in liquid time that solved for variables that shouldn't exist. Each droplet contained complete timelines, compressed and distilled into temporal concentrate. The entities weren't just collecting time, they were distilling it, reducing entire histories into pure temporal essence. My presence completed some vast calculation they'd been computing across centuries, The confrontation reached its peak as they revealed their true form, a vast, liquid consciousness that existed in all moments simultaneously. Through the rain, I glimpsed their impossible geometry, a shape that could only exist by occupying multiple points in time at once. They weren't just bending time, they were its architects, using human perception to stabilize their existence in our reality. Each observation we made strengthened their hold on our dimension. Fighting back required impossible decisions. I began acting randomly, making choices that contradicted causality itself. Each paradox I created disrupted their patterns, forcing them to expend energy maintaining temporal coherence. The rain responded with increasing violence, trying to drown me in alternate histories. Every droplet showed a different version of my death, each more horrifying than the last. The battle reached quantum levels as reality broke down completely. My random actions had created too many contradictions, too many paradoxes for them to process. The entities began to lose control of their temporal farm, centuries of carefully cultivated timelines collapsing into chaos. Through the dissolving windows in space-time, I watched other victims break free from their loops, each escape creating ripples that weakened the entities' hold on reality. Victory seemed within reach until I realized their true endgame. The chaos I'd caused was part of their plan. They were using the temporal disruption to tear a hole between dimensions. As reality collapsed around us, something began emerging through the rain, an ancient intelligence that had seeded these entities across time and space. My resistance hadn't disrupted their harvest, it had completed it. Consciousness returned in fragments, each memory belonging to a different timeline. I woke in a Portland hospital. Though according to their records, I'd been admitted in 3 different decades simultaneously. My body existed in quantum superposition, aging and rejuvenating in waves that made observation impossible. The doctors couldn't determine my true age. Every test showed different results, as if time itself had forgotten how to flow properly. The apparent escape brought disturbing revelation. My research notes contained observations spanning centuries, written in versions of my handwriting that evolved through multiple lifetimes. The rain had left permanent changes in my cellular structure. My blood flow moved backwards, my neurons fired before receiving signals, and my consciousness regularly slipped between moments. The entities hadn't just marked me, they'd fundamentally altered my relationship with time. The consequences manifested in impossible ways. Electronics near me experienced random temporal shifts, aging decades or reverting to previous states. Mirrors showed reflections from different eras, my face cycling through lifetimes in seconds. Most disturbing were the memories, not just mine, but thousands of experiences collected by the rain, all fighting for space in my consciousness. I remembered lives I hadn't lived yet, deaths I'd both experienced and avoided. Further investigation revealed connections I wish I'd never found. Similar incidents dotted the Pacific Northwest history, each matching the pattern of my encounter. The entities had been running their experiment for centuries, using the region's constant rain as cover for their temporal harvesting. Government files mentioned chronological anomalies and temporal bleed, documenting decades of research into the phenomenon. Every case connected back to the same ancient intelligence. The pattern pointed to a horrifying truth. The entities hadn't been harvesting time randomly. They'd been selecting specific moments, specific decisions that shaped human history. Each temporal loop they created strengthened their control over our timeline. The rain wasn't just their tool or offspring. It was their method of reproduction, using human consciousness as a breeding ground for new temporal parasites. The ancient tribes hadn't warned about them. They documented their evolution. 1 week after my escape, I noticed the first droplet, a single bead of water moving upward against gravity, containing a reflection of myself writing this warning. The entity's experiment had succeeded, using my mind as a template for their next generation. As I write this, I feel them growing inside my consciousness, turning my memories into windows between moments. The rain ain't just falling anymore. It's learning to think, and every storm brings it closer to completion.